All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for what I think is going to be a really excellent discussion. This is the Columbus Museum's panel discussion of the 2019 documentary, Lillian Smith, Breaking the Silence. My name is Rebecca Bush, and I'm the Curator of History and Exhibitions Manager at the Columbus Museum in Georgia. We're thrilled to present today's talk in conjunction with our current exhibition, And So She Did, Women of the Chattahoochee Valley. This exhibition was generously sponsored by AFLAC and was also supported by Georgia Humanities in partnership with the Georgia Department of Economic Development through funding from the Georgia General Assembly. Georgia Humanities also helped support the creation of this documentary. Today's conversation will focus on Georgia writer and civil rights activist Lillian Smith, including some discussion of her friendship with Columbus native and Southern Gothic writer Carson Mcculler. I'll begin by asking our panelists a few questions, and then we'll open the Zoom floor, so to speak, for your own questions. Please use the Q&A function towards the bottom of your screen or the chat box to ask your questions when we come to that part of the program. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. Hal Jacobs brings a career in freelance writing and developing written and video resources for higher education into film work that focuses on arts, social justice, and the environment. The Lillian Smith documentary, in collaboration with his son, Henry, is his first full-length project. Previously, he worked on a short documentary about Georgia weaver, Mary Hambidge, who founded the Hambidge Center for the Creative Arts and Sciences, the oldest artist residency program in the Southeast. And I believe, Hal, that's where you're coming to us from today?
Yeah.
Yes. His next project looks at a liberal arts education program taking place in Georgia prisons, Common Good, Atlanta. Henry Jacobs is a photographer, filmmaker, and musician. He is also the Middle Chattahoochee Outreach Director for the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. His photography has appeared publicly in several juried exhibitions and can be found in the permanent collection of the Lamar Dodd Art Center of LaGrange College. A licensed drone pilot, in 2016, he traveled to Guatemala to produce documentary films for a project called Love Crosses Borders. Dr. Patricia Bell Scott is Professor Emerita of Women's Studies at the University of Georgia, and the author of The Firebrand and the First Lady, Portrait of a Friendship, Polly Murray, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the Struggle for Social Justice, which won the Lillian Smith Book Award in 2017. This book was also nominated for the National Book Award, and it was a finalist for the Andrew Carnegie Award for Excellence in Nonfiction. Dr. Nick Norwood, last but not least, is a professor of creative writing and the director of Columbus State University's Carson Mcculler Center for Writers and Musicians. His poems have appeared in over 50 national and international journals, anthologies, and public broadcasts, including the PBS NewsHour site, Artbeat, and on NPR's Writer's Almanac with Garrison Keillor. He has published 3 full volumes of poetry and, in collaboration with artist Erica Adams, 2 limited edition fine press books. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. So before we dive into questions, I just have to take a moment to share how excited I am to talk about this topic, because Lillian Smith was really what drew me to the South as an historian and a public historian. When I was a junior in college, I was introduced to her work. I was taking a Southern history course, and the professor was a native of Birmingham, Alabama, and she assigned us to read Killers of the Dream. And that struck me and really grabbed hold of me. So I pulled out my copy and off my bookshelf. And I just wanted to read a couple paragraphs from a letter to her publisher that she wrote in the 60s. So this book was published in the late 40s, and in the 1960s, she wrote to a publisher for a revised edition of the book. And she's reflecting on why she wrote the book, and she writes that in part, I wrote it because I had to find out what life in a segregated culture had done to me, one person. I had to put down on paper these experiences so that I could see their meaning for me. I was in dialogue with myself as I wrote, as well as with my hometown and my childhood and history and the future and the past. Writing is both horizontal and vertical exploration. It has to true itself with facts, but also with feelings and symbols and memories that are never quite facts, but sometimes closer to the truth than is any fact. We want to start today's conversation also with a callback to recently departed civil rights activist who is someone I feel privileged to have shared the earth with, who is John Lewis. And Helen Henry, you posted on a page associated with the documentary a few weeks ago that John Lewis once said of Lillian Smith, during the early 60s, I had an opportunity to meet Lillian Smith. Her writings, her words inspired us all to do better. Whatever we do in the days, the weeks, the months, the years to come, we must walk with the wind and let the spirit of history be our guide. This quote really struck me because I thought it was a really eloquent connection of Lillian Smith's words in the past, nearly 80 years ago, and her impact for today. And so I wanted to start by asking everyone, what drew you to this project or this panel? Why did you want to be involved? And why is Lillian Smith's story still relevant today?
I'll be happy to start. I think recent events show us the importance of white voices talking about the injustices that we're seeing in society. And Lillian Smith saw the need for this 75, 80 years ago. She should certainly be, I think, a hero to today's generation of people, and an important role model. And she did that by looking deep inside herself, like you just read from Killers. She examined her own self, and I think that's a journey that a lot of white people should take. And it's a hard journey. And she wrote about it in just so expressive and clear terms that her writing still seems so fresh today. What you just read, somebody could have written that for the New York Times editorial page today, I think. And I think that's what really drew us to her.
I was drawn to this project for several reasons. First of all, she's always impressed me through her writings as a very compassionate person. And that drew me to her because the writing spoke to me on that level. And then I have, I guess, a personal or perhaps a selfish inclination that pulls me in her direction. And that is, I count her as sort of a literary mentor, even though I obviously never had the chance to meet her. But I came to know her as a writer through the letters she wrote to Pauli Murray, encouraging Murray's writing career. And I feel like I learned so much about the writing process, about the search to get to know oneself, that I've come through two major works, the Firebrand and the First Lady, and my efforts to write an introduction, which I did do for Pauli Murray's Proud Shoes, which Lillian Smith probably read in draft more than anyone else. And it was her efforts to encourage Murray to go deep, to look truth in the face, no matter how deeply it hurt, that just had such an impression on me. And so when I got the opportunity to participate in this project, I felt like I owed Lillian Smith my best to carry on her work and to let people know about her. Just like Pauli Murray, I feel often quite frustrated at the fact that people don't know about her. And I really think not only do we need to praise her for her work as a civil rights activist, but this was an incredible writer. And I don't think she gets the credit that she deserves. She should be part of the canon with Faulkner and all of those people who are who were her peers, her age mates. And so I was happy to participate because I really want to do what I can to bring her back to the forefront.
Thank you.
And I'll add that for me, this experience really came about because my dad and his work, you know, getting into film and looking for films to document. But right, so to get involved and then to get to work with my father on this subject, to get to know Lillian, who I had never heard about in any history class in school. And I was a history major at a small liberal arts school in LaGrange. So to only learn of her now in my late 20s. But, you know, just to kind of finish by saying that experience of over 2 years, you know, piecing together this film from hundreds of hours of footage and then having these conversations with my dad, you know, just kind of downtime, piecing together how we were going to put together, you know, a film in 50 minutes that really spoke to Lillian and her work. We had to have that conversation and that experience as two white men, but to get to do it with my father it's a very meaningful experience. So just glad to be here now to get to share more about it.
Thanks, Henry.
Yep.
Nick,
And
would you like to round us out?
yeah, and as the director of the Carson Mcculler Center, Lillian Smith is important to me because she was important to Carson. They were friends, and certainly they were simpatico in so many ways, especially with respect to social justice issues. And so that's the main reason that I would want to be involved in today's conversation and in this project. But there was also something really important that happened in Carson's life that directly involved Lillian Smith. And I'll talk about that later when we get to those questions. But yeah, glad to be here.
That's a great tease. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone. We're going to dive into some specific questions now. The first one goes to Hal and Henry as the documentarians. The film begins with a James Baldwin quotation. Lillian Smith is a very great, heroic, very lonely figure. You also end with a quotation from James Baldwin, and there's an epilogue to the film that includes some very powerful words from two civil rights activists from Georgia. But you also include the words and voices and the images of white supremacist politicians in the South at that time. And so I wanted to talk to you about your choices as filmmakers to include those. Why was it important to you to bookend your film with these James Baldwin quotes, to include the voices of these civil rights participants who at the time were both still living and with us? But also why was it important to include those uglier voices that we don't like to hear now, those white supremacist politicians?
Well, for us, no one could validate Lillian Smith's importance better than James Baldwin to us. I mean, he has just become this voice that we look back to, and we trust him, and we trust his insight into white culture, the way he read it at the time. And we were concerned at the time, not knowing much about Lillian Smith. We only learned about her through all these conversations that show up in the film and by reading. But we were concerned people might see her as the white messiah type figure, the white person who has all the answers to all the problems for the Black community. And Baldwin assured us that she wasn't that type. George Yancey in the film also spoke to that, as did Lonnie King and some of the others. She was a white person who looked at herself and discovered, the toxic effects of segregation and white supremacy on her. And so when Baldwin talks about she was a heroic figure, we got to believe him at his word. Martin Luther King Jr. felt the same way. She stood up in the South when standing up and speaking up meant you were going to get into a lot of trouble. John Lewis calls it good trouble, but your livelihood was threatened, your life was threatened. She was threatened with bomb attacks. The Klan threatened her. Her cabin was burned down by some whites in the community at one point. But she didn't leave the South. She didn't go live in exile in Paris or New York City. She stayed there. She said, that's where my roots are, and this is where I'm going to write from. So that took courage, and she became a lonely figure because, you know, not a lot of people wanted to be associated with her. A lot of the editors, Southern editors like Ralph McGill, put her down, and she felt silenced her. She lost her income as a writer. She lost her reputation for being a literary person, like Dr. Bell Scott said. She wanted to be seen as the equivalent of Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, and others, but she was categorized as a race writer. And that reputation has carried on, and it may be one of the reasons we don't all know more about her, and she's not taught more widely in the schools. So we bookended with Baldwin. And instead of showing all of the physical violence that people associate with the South, the Birmingham violence, the lynchings, we wanted to hear the violence of white leaders, politicians. We wanted you to hear their words. And then we wanted to hear what Lillian Smith said about them, about the white demagogue, about how they use fear, about how they try to separate people. And scare people with these tactics. Henry, anything you want to add to that?
And yeah, I can just add that I think for one, kind of the two roles that me and my dad played together in making this film, you know, he really came at it from his experience as a writer and a kind of researching. And I really focused more on kind of the visual effects and wanting this film to appeal to a younger audience like myself. And so using the James Baldwin quotes and using some archival footage that, you know, is stuff I had never seen in any other documentary films about the time was important, just to kind of trigger a new kind of response. But also, and, you know, I would just add, you know, the music we incorporated, including a local Columbus, Jake Fussell, you know, bringing in some music to really kind of help keep things moving. But right, I think my dad said it all, said it well.
Thank you both. I really appreciate what you said, Hal, about showing the verbal violence, so to speak. The physical violence is connected to the verbal violence and that they reinforce each other. And the graphic elements of that come through as well. So thank you both. Nick, we're going to turn to you. Columbus native and author Carson Mcculler became friends with Lillian Smith. She shared many of her social values and expressed them in her writing as well. Can you tell us a little bit about how Carson and Lillian met, what their relationship was like? How do they influence and support each other, and how their work and lives are both similar and different to each other?
Yeah, and I should say, first of all, that I'm relying mostly on the biography of Virginia Spencer Carr, who was on faculty at then Columbus College when she published her biography of Carson Mccullers in 1975. And she really did a lot of research. What she reports is that Carson and Lillian Smith met in New York right after the success of Carson's Broadway production of her own novel, The Member at the Wedding. She doesn't say a lot about that, but she does say that they met at that time, and that would have been about 1950, 1951. And then in 1953, after Carson had come back from France, because of the success of The Member of the Wedding, she made a lot of money. She was able to buy a house in France, and she and her husband, Reeves, lived there. Carson and Reeves had a very tumultuous relationship. They married and divorced and then remarried, and then they had a lot of problems in that remarriage. Carson claims that Reeves wanted to commit joint suicide, And so Carson left him and came back to the States. And she had been commissioned by Holiday Magazine to write a story about Georgia, to write a journalism piece about Georgia. So she decided that she needed to go spend some more time in Georgia. She lived in Nyack, New York at the time. And she said, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll just go stay with Lillian Smith. And so without contacting Lillian Smith, she told her agent to contact Lillian and tell her that she was on her way. As it happened, Lillian Smith had just had surgery and was not in a very strong physical condition at that time. And so it was not a good thing for Carson to be coming, but there it was. What could you do? She was coming. And so she came to stay with Lillian Smith and Paula Snelling there in North Georgia. And by their account, she immediately began telling all of her, airing all of her dirty laundry about her husband and how terrible he was, and about all of these bad things that he was doing, and how he had wanted to commit suicide, and he was running around on her and all of these things. Meanwhile, the phone rings, and it is Carson's sister calling to tell Lillian Smith to tell Carson that Reeves has committed suicide. And so apparently Lillian Smith said, oh, well, Carson is here. Would you like to speak to her? And Carson's sister said no. And she said, I want you to tell her. And so Lillian Smith later told Paula Snelling, or asked her if she would tell Carson. And so it was the next morning that Paula Snelling told Carson that her husband had committed suicide, which was a major psychological and emotional blow to Carson Mcculler that took her a long time to overcome. So that was the big thing that happened in Carson's life that directly involved Lillian Smith, because she was at Lillian's house. I've been thinking a lot about the ways that they were alike and different. Obviously, they had very similar views on social justice issues. And I think in that way that they supported each other, in that they both supported each other's work, and that they felt the same way about a lot of issues, especially on the issue of race. And you can see there was an earlier documentary, a TV documentary on Lillian Smith called Miss Smith of Georgia. It was made in 1963, and they interviewed Carson McCullers. It's one of the few times that you can see Carson McCullers on film speaking and talking. I only know of one other one, in fact. She's in very ill health at that point, but she says some very nice things about Lillian Smith, and talks about the importance of her work, and how, what a great writer she believed her to be. The ways that they are different, I think, the labels that are placed on writers, I think, are clumsy at best, almost always. But I think as a way of maybe just distinguishing, what was different about them in terms of their fiction writing, is that I believe Lillian Smith would probably be called a social realist, and Carson McCullers would be called, a Southern Gothic writer. And I mean, there's a lot of overlap there. I think a lot of people could call Hard as a Lonely Hunter a social realist novel, but certainly, works like The Ballad of the Sad Cafe, you can see why people refer to it as Southern Gothic. But again, I think those terms are clumsy, but at least maybe it helps us to see how the ways that they were different. And in terms of their nonfiction, I thought of this, and it sounds snarky. I don't mean it to be, but maybe it's the best way to describe it. And that is that Lillian Smith was a successful journalist. Carson McCullers was a failed journalist. And so to me, in terms of, maybe that says as much about the difference between both of them and all of their writing is anything I can say. So I'll leave it there for the moment. Yeah.
Thanks, Nick. That was great. We're going to move to Pat. We're going to bring in your Lillian Smith Award-winning book about Pauli Murray, who you referenced earlier, which focused on the relationship between Murray, who was a civil rights activist, and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. In the documentary, you also discuss Lillian's correspondence with Eleanor Roosevelt and the influence that her writing had on Pauli Murray as a writer and an activist. Could you tell us a little bit more about these three extraordinary women and how they inspired and influenced each other?
Well, perhaps the trait that connects each of them is the fact that they were compassionate women who could be moved to follow wherever that compassion took them. And that often took them against the grain. And these were not women who would feel deeply about something and not move. So what that meant is that they shared these democratic values, and that took them into work with the NAACP. They were supporters of the Southern Conference of Human Welfare. They were involved in the Americans for Democratic Action. They were also three women who were writers. Both Eleanor Roosevelt and Lillian Smith were journalists, and they had columns. And Pauli Murray had hoped to one day perhaps be a journalist, but she was sidetracked by her inclination to fight issues of injustice through law. So she went to law school, and that took her on a detour. And they supported each other in various ways. For example, when Lillian Smith's the journal that which she and Paula Snelling were editing, the North Georgia Review, was when they were having trouble getting it distributed by the post office. Eleanor used her political influence and spoke to the Attorney General, who spoke to the postmaster in Georgia so that the North Georgia Review could be distributed. When Strange Fruit was published, it was banned, and there was a discussion about that it was banned and couldn't be distributed. And again, Eleanor Roosevelt spoke with Franklin so that that ban was removed. Lillian Smith had an impact on both Eleanor and Pauli as an example of a writer who could move people, so that when Killers of the Dream was published, one of the persons that Eleanor was desperate to have read it was Adlai Stevenson when he was running for the presidential, when he was running for the presidency. She did not feel, nor did Pauli feel, that he really had a grasp on the emotional aspects of racism and prejudice. So they were desperate for him to read it. When the Brown decision came down from the US Supreme Court, Pauli was so excited and anxious to see public figures support the ruling. And Lillian Smith, of course, held it as every child's Magna Carta, and Eleanor Roosevelt endorsed it in her column, My Day. So that they were the two white public figures who spoke out in support of it. And as I said earlier, both of them read drafts of Proud Shoes, but Lillian Smith was so instrumental in Pauli's in the writing of Proud Shoes. It would not be what has become a classic Black family memoir, a saga, had it not been for the impact of Lillian Smith. And there is a wonderful letter that she wrote to Pauli. I'd just like to read just a few lines because I keep them posted near me because it helps me when I'm writing. And what she said to Pauli, which I take to heart, is work on your book gently, evenly, but not at a rapid pace. It is important to remember that it is not when a book is finished, but what kind of book is finally done. And I love this line. She writes, some aspects of the writing process are unknowable and emotionally taxing. So take the time to reveal first to yourself, then to the reader, and then take time to heal. For all this hurts like the very devil, and no publisher can know the wounds we give ourselves. So take your time on it. So she is trying to convey to Pauli what a psychological process this whole writing enterprise is. And I have really taken that to heart and have shared it with students and writing colleagues, because I really think she was really onto something there. And she shared that with Polly. And both Eleanor Roosevelt and Polly felt that they learned a tremendous amount from Lillian Smith's autobiographical book, The Journey, where she really does try to dig deep and look at difficult issues like self-doubt and fear. And when Polly was in situations where she was struggling with those issues, she would pull The Journey off the shelf and read passages. So they had a tremendous impact on each other. And Polly, of course, the younger of the two, Lillian and Eleanor were of the same generation, but Polly was much younger. She was of the next generation and lived longer. But for the rest of her life, she carried their legacy and would speak of their legacy and the impact on her life, and considered herself a carrier, someone responsible for carrying what she considered this legacy of being a woman of conscience.
Thank you for sharing that. Those are some wonderful connections there between those three. And I also love to hear those words and advice on writing. As someone who's done a lot of writing this summer, I take that to heart as well too. And that actually leads us really nicely into our next question, which is that, as we mentioned at the beginning of the program, you are a winner of the Lillian Smith Book Award, which was established to honor books that continue her legacy. So as a writer, what did it mean to you, or what does it mean to you today to have received that award? And do you feel like your works are in the vein of her works, or have a kinship to her writing?
To win the Lillian Smith Book Award, to me, for me, that was my Pulitzer. Because it carries with it recognition of a work as addressing and carrying on that tradition of highlighting issues of social justice. It means so much to me. So I was so deeply honored, and I feel like it connects me in another way to Lillian Smith, because she mentored Polly. And I feel like the two of them mentored me through my reading and study of the letters between the two of them. So it means a tremendous amount to me. I really feel that Lillian Smith, her tradition as a writer of conscience, and the impact she had on Pauli Murray, who is in the midst of, there's a tremendous amount of attention and interest around her right now, because she is viewed as an icon by so many different groups, whether we're talking about human rights activists. She was co-founder of NOW, the recent Supreme Court decision in which the Supreme Court outlawed workplace discrimination for LGBTQ persons. She's credited as having been responsible for for her early work as a lawyer, in which she laid the foundation for that. And I'm tremendously excited about all of this for her, but I want so desperately for people to see her also as the literary artist that she was. She was not only a great writer of prose, but also an accomplished poet. And Lillian Smith is partly responsible for her growth and her maturation as a poet and a writer of note. I think it's really, I take great pride in the fact that since publication of The Firebrand and the First Lady and the Lillian Smith Book Award, it received both Pauli Murray's memoir and her collection of poetry have come back into print. So I feel like we have a wonderful synergy going on right now with Lillian Smith and Pauli Murray. So I'm tremendously pleased to be a part of what's happening with the both of them.
Thank you. Very well said. We're going to go ahead and open up our discussion for questions. We already have a couple in the Q&A, so I'll start to move to those. If you have additional questions, if you're with us in Zoom, please go ahead and use the Q&A function to do that. If you're joining us via Facebook, please go ahead and write those comments. Write your questions as comments in the Facebook feed, and those will be relayed to us. I do want to include comments from Laura McCarty, President of Georgia Humanities, who's joining us today. Hi, Laura. And she wanted everyone to know that the 2020 Lillian Smith Book Awards will be presented in an online event on September 6th at 2 p.m. as part of the Decatur Book Festival. You can find out more if you search for the Facebook event 2020 Lillian Smith Book Awards. You could probably Google that as well and find out more. So thank you for that, Laura. One of the questions relates to a question that was on our list, so I'll go ahead and tackle that. Lillian Smith not only spoke out against segregation and systemic racism, but she was a lesbian woman in a time and place that prized patriarchal and heteronormative systems even more highly than they are today. So I wanted to add, and this is open to anybody on the panel, how did Smith's gender and her sexuality influence her life and activism? We know we can relate this to Carson Mccullers as well, with how she thought about and interacted with her gender and sexuality. So there are lots of layers to explore with these ladies on the topics of gender and sexuality. So I'll open it up to the floor if anyone would like to tackle that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because I was thinking of Carson McCullers as you were saying that, and you know, we started a podcast, McCuller Center, to talk about Carson McCullers' work, and we've asked some of our interviewees these same questions. And here's one theory about why a Carson McCullers or a Lillian Smith could have such progressive views on social justice issues, and that is that, being other themselves, they were able to empathize with people who were also othered. And I don't, you know, it's a theory, and I don't know if anybody can say conclusively what it was, but it's you know, it's a theory that that I feel is maybe on target. And so it's, you know, it's the fact that they were different themselves that allowed them to see what it was like to be outside of the mainstream of the culture and to empathize with people who were. So
I would agree with that as well. And I would also point out that she never identified as a lesbian in her lifetime. She'd had relationships with men before she met Paula. And then she was in a committed relationship for over 35 years with Paula Snelling, who did identify as a lesbian and who outlived Lillian and talked more about their loving relationship. So in the film, we're very careful not to say or to define her one way or the other. We just want to show what that relationship meant to Lillian. And I think it made her the writer that she is, because Paula was a brilliant woman from Macon, Wesley. So yeah, so I think she did write about sexism probably as much in Killers of the Dream as she did racism. She talked about how both of those build walls and sort of destroy the psyche of people on both sides of the walls.
I also think it's important for us to remember the social and historical context in which they were functioning. And, you know, I think it would be unfair to look back and to say, oh, she was in the closet. Because I get the sense, I've not seen any letters that confirm that she and Paulie talked directly about the issue of sexuality, but the greetings and the closings suggest, at least to me, that Paulie recognized that they were a couple. And that when Lillian would respond, there were always this, and Paula says hello. I mean, it didn't sound like she was writing to say her secretary asked about her. And that was kind of the guise under which some people saw Paula later in life. And their relationship and the way in which it was perceived or presented was not unlike how many women in that generation who were in committed relationships lived. And I think one of the things I say in the documentary that I think it's important for us to remember, and that is they were living through McCarthyism. This is a time when if one is if women talk about sexuality, even if we're talking about heterosexuality during this period, one could get into trouble because women are not supposed to be sexual beings. And then if one is not heterosexual, that is even more problematic. One could be jailed, one could be institutionalized. So it's important to take that into consideration. And I guess I don't necessarily see her as in hiding, though I've had some people ask me, well, was she deep into the closet? And I think sometimes when we look at things through the eyes of 2020 or where we are right now, the language and the way in which we see it perhaps is not a good fit for the context in which they were living.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone's really thoughtful answers on that. And I especially appreciate you highlighting the historical context and also the ambiguity that her life had in many aspects and that we should respect. So thank you for that. I was thinking in particular about the term intersectionality when talking and thinking about social justice issues is something that is really vital to our understanding today. And that term was coined decades after Lillian was with us. But in many ways, even with working within a more, you might say, restrictive or just a different context of her time. In some ways, especially in Killers of the Dream, she's exemplifying intersectionality and tackling multiple social ills at the same time. We'll go to.
I'd like to just
add
one other thing, and this is about just the issue of gender, and that is, I certainly do believe the fact that she was female and unconventional. And Southern, a Southern woman who spoke out, who lived up in the mountains with a life partner, who would dare say things about Southern mores, who would dare write a book about an interracial romance. All of that, I think, contributed to the way that she was treated as a writer and is still treated as a writer, that she was unconventional and female. And then clearly suspicions about her sexuality. I think all that has fed into the way in which she has been treated. And I think she's been unfairly diminished. And I'm so grateful to Hal and Henry for the film, because I think it helps to bring her to the fore again.
Thank you. We're gonna take a question from Facebook, and I will open this round robin to anyone. Maybe you'll all want to weigh in. Thinking about Lillian Smith and or Carson Mccullers, if you could choose one must read, what would it be?
Well, I'll say about Carson Mccullers that the one must read to me is The Heart is the Lonely Hunter. But Mccullers fans differ on that issue. Some Hilton Halls, who was here, thinks that Ballad of the Sad Cafe is the great work, and people disagree. But to me, Heart is the Lonely Hunter is the work by Carson Mccullers that you must read. And if I were to say about Lillian Smith, which I'm not an expert on in any manner, that to me, Killers of the Dream is the one that I would choose.
I would say in 2016, UGA Press published Rose Gladney and Lisa Hodgins' compilation of her works called A Lillian Smith Reader. And in that you see excerpts, but you also see a lot of her personal letters. And to me, that revealed so much of her personality and her humor and her insights that it sort of charmed me into telling her story in a way that I wouldn't have gotten if I had just read her works. But I would agree. I would start with Killers of the Dream too. I think that still speaks to us today.
I agree with both Nick and Hal. And if you want to go further, I'd say The Journey.
And then also Strange Fruit too. That was I guess one of her first works and was a best-selling.
And the bestseller.
Yeah.
I think for myself, I have to fourth, I started to say third, but fourth, Killers of the Dream, that was transformational for me. And my favorite Mccullers is actually The Member of the Wedding. It is in some ways a deceptively simple story about a young girls coming of age. It has very humorous moments, very tragic moments. But the more that you read it and dig into it, and the more time that you spend with it, the more thought-provoking it becomes about identity and how we understand ourselves in that transition from childhood to adulthood, and also specifically from girlhood to womanhood. So that would be my pick. Thank you. Facebook. We will go into our Q&A. We have 2 questions from Sarah Lee Crumbs. Thanks for joining us today. Perhaps this first question just to our filmmakers. With our current climate, how do you want this documentary to be used or seen today? And I know that you have a lot of virtual film. I know you did a lot of screenings last year, and you have a lot of virtual screenings lined up for this year as well.
Well, Henry, you probably want to add to this, but we see this as a delivery device for talking about these issues in a way that people are more comfortable. I mean, we've seen it with audiences after the film that may have felt defensive about hearing some of these things that are brought up in the film, but seeing it through Lillian Smith's gaze and her time, it's a way for people to take that in a way that they can make use of it and talk about some of those issues. And this summer we've been doing a lot of free screenings, and we've been doing a lot of conversations like this that we want to continue doing as well.
And I would just add, in the kind of period of time last fall when we were having in-person screenings of the film, right, the dialogue kind of after was just interesting, right, to have everybody in the same room. I, in particular, remember one screening here in LaGrange at LaGrange College, and a number of the students were speaking up. And it was interesting. There was definitely different sides being voiced, but right, just kind of that historical context, which totally applies to the experiences today.
Thank you. When we were planning this, we talked about how even more than when we had originally planned this presentation for April in person, her story and this documentary is more timely and relevant than ever. And then for Nick and Pat, our writers and English scholars, how can we encourage writers today to find their voices and passion as Lillian Smith did?
Pat,
I know
will
it
defer to
sounds.
you. Yeah.
I was going to say, I know it sounds trite, but reading, reading is just vital. I also think that trying to find and make community is really important. And I'm not a Carson McCullers expert, Nick is, but I know that one of the things that Lillian benefited from tremendously, and I think Paula Snelling doesn't get enough credit for this, is that she was a tremendous reader. And I mean, Lillian had in Paula a life partner who read everything and gave her wonderful feedback, and probably could have been a fantastic and successful writer in her own right, but left that arena to Lillian. So cultivating, and when you can, developing a partnership with someone who can be, finding a really good reader. I think and reading, and knowing what nurtures you as a writer, and knowing what distracts you, so that I know I have to stay off the internet until after 12, or else I'll find myself surfing. So, and right now, try not to watch too much news until I can answer the creative impulse. So learning, in many ways, following Lillian's advice to Polly about learning yourself, learning what works for you, learning how to nurture yourself, learning self-care, though I dare say they both worked really, really hard. And sometimes I think could have taken better care, but going deep and learning about yourself so that you can become a better person and a better writer.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback on that and say that I agree with the that you want to do a lot of reading, and I think you want to find those writers that inspire you. Being the director of the Mcculler Center, I've given house tours of the Smith McCullers house to people from all over the world, and it's clear to me that Carson McCullers has been a huge inspiration for a lot of people in the arts, a lot of other writers, but also people in film, people in music. And so I think that if you want to write and find your own voice, that one of the things that you have to do is to find your own Carson McCullers or Lillian Smith. Find those writers or artists who inspire you and who make you want to go forward with your own work.
Thank you both. A couple more questions. Bill Consoletti, hi Bill. If someone could speak to if there were any specific events or personal happenings in Lillian's life that caused her to focus on social justice and systemic racism as her one of her lifelong causes. If anyone would like to speak to that.
Well,
one of the early things, and then maybe Hal will want to say more about this, but one of the early things was the time she spent in China, where she was teaching music to children and seeing the discrimination, the prejudice there against them in their own land. I mean, and so seeing that, and then she saw things as a child.
Yeah, I agree. Lillian Smith talks about that experience in China being very formative. And then the other thing was being director of a girls' camp, a privileged white girls' camp, for over 20 years, in which she was trying to educate and inculcate social justice values with the children there, who were going back to very conservative, Southern households where they couldn't put into practice what they learned at Miss Lil's camp. But I think that process really was very stimulating and motivated her to want to help the larger community, not just these girls, but other people living in the South who didn't feel comfortable speaking up.
Thank you. Well said. So as we start to wrap up, I'm going to ask a final question, but also use it to bring in our final audience question. And thanks to our audience on Zoom and on Facebook for your great questions, because this is a very specific audience question that kind of ties into our planned final question. Columbus journalists Julian and Julia Collier Harris won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service and wrote in opposition to the Ku Klux Klan and against lynching during the 1920s and 30s. They did that both as editors of the, I believe it's the Inquirer newspaper here in Columbus, and then also working as journalists in Atlanta. Is there any evidence that they crossed paths with Lillian Smith? And I wish I knew the answer to that because I'm big fans of all these people, but I don't know. Does anyone on our esteemed panel know of any connection?
I don't know for sure the answer to that question about their crossing paths, but certainly Lillian Smith knew all about Julian Harris because she mentions him in Killers of the Dream and says that there are too many journalists out there who don't have the courage to report what they know to be the truth about this, except, she says, Julian Harris, who's writing for the Columbus, Georgia Inquirer. So.
I don't know about them, but I think they need a documentary made about them.
I think I know two folks who might be able to do that. I think you volunteered yourself for that, but yes, I would agree. So for our very final question, the documentary covered a lot of information about Lillian Smith's life, and for anyone who's watching and hasn't had a chance to view the documentary yet, there's a link that has been posted in the chat, and I believe also hopefully in the Facebook comments, that will take you to a free screening of that film. It is still live through Saturday, so you have a couple more days to watch that. It's really wonderful, well worth your time, but I'm sure that there were lots of hard choices about what to include and what to leave out. So for everyone, if you could explore one topic from the film further or introduce a new one, what would it be?
Henry, you want to go?
I guess I would just say, and it has been covered somewhat. My dad mentioned how Lillian Smith was leading this girls' summer camp for about 20 years of her life. And so you had hundreds, maybe thousands of young women who attended that camp and then, led their lives and had children. And so there's a couple generations now, including the folks living today who had that connection to Lillian and were influenced by her. And it seems like a lot of them have taken kind of a stronger stance on social justice issues. So that's a whole rabbit hole. But I know personally I had a chance to connect with someone here in LaGrange, Georgia, who attended the summer camp in her youth, and it definitely influenced her life going forward.
Great,
And
thank
I
you.
would add to that there were other white women who were as brave and courageous as Lillian Smith, living in the South, and heroic and lonely as well. And it would have been nice to add more of that into the story and not make it seem like she was the only one at the time. But we're limited with time and budget and everything. But that would be something that would be. I would like to think people would go to that. Besides reading her works, they would also want to know about stories about other people like her who were standing up.
Thank you, Howard.
I've had several colleagues say to me that Killers of the Dream had such an impact on them. And this would have been taking the film away, but to just have been able to had just a couple of moments where people talked about how transformative it was for them to engage with this text. I had people say it just changed their life to read the book. And I've had people say that about the journey too. So to just have like little snippets of the impact of her work would have been personal impact. We know about the social impact because, there was this resistance and we had little newspaper clippings and excerpts about how people responded. But the but the transformative impact of her work would have been interesting, I think, to this current generation.
Thank you, Pat.
Yeah, I think that in the case of both Lillian Smith and Carson McCullers, that maybe their time has come. There's a new piece in the New York Review of Books on a new book that's been written about Carson McCullers, but the first paragraph of the piece talks about how she has been seen not as important as William Faulkner or Flannery O'Connor or Eudora Welty or any of the Catherine Ann Porter. And I think that maybe the time has come for Lillian Smith and Carson McCullers to be seen as more important, maybe, to upcoming writers right now than Faulkner or O'Connor or some of those other writers. So I would love to see that explored more fully.
Thank you, Nick, and I co-sign all of what you just said. I think there is obviously enough material for many more documentaries and articles and writings, and I hope that this dialogue continues, as I'm sure it will. Thank you to all of us. Thank you to all of you for joining us today, and thanks to all our participants for watching and sharing your great questions with us. The Columbus Museum has reopened with limited hours and safety precautions in place. We are also continuing a full slate of virtual programming through the fall. You can find out more by visiting columbusmuseum.com or keeping up with our events on Facebook. And I will let you know on August 26th, which is Women's Equality Day, we will be helping Historic Columbus dedicate the city's newest historic marker as recognizing Columbus as the birthplace of the women's suffrage movement in Georgia. So stay tuned for more information on that and all our programs coming up. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll hope to see you online or in person soon. Bye.
Bye, y'all. Enjoyed
Bye.
it. Thanks for
Bye.
having me.
Bye.